Its own pilots called it the flying coffin and hated it for its sluggishness. The Germans laughed when they saw the 7-ton milk truck in the sky, but they didn't realize they were laughing at the most perfect machine for total destruction ever created by man. In this film, we will show how a plane that didn't know how to fight by the rules forced the entire world to play by its own, how its greatest weakness, its monstrous weight, became its greatest weapon, and how this clumsy sledgehammer ultimately ground more tanks, trains, and Wehrmacht divisions to dust than any other fighter in history. October 1944. The Wolf Pack was left without its leader. Colonel Hubert Zemke, the man who taught the Thunderbolt to kill, the man whose name struck terror into the hearts of Luftwaffe pilots, vanished from the sky. He wasn't shot down by an enemy ace. He wasn't ambushed by an anti-aircraft battery. He was defeated by the elements. Zemke, like many commanders, had switched to the more modern P-51 Mustang. On that fateful day, he was leading his group on another mission. The weather was rapidly deteriorating. The sky was covered with black, heavy clouds. They were flying straight into the heart of a storm front. Modern pilots bypass such fronts by dozens of kilometers. But back then, they had no weather radar, no accurate forecasts. They flew blind, trusting only their experience and the strength of their machines. But even for the Mustang, this storm proved too strong. Zemke's plane was caught in the epicenter of the tempest. It was tossed from side to side like a splinter in the ocean. Monstrous updrafts and downdrafts tore at the metal. He fought. He tried to break free from the storm's icy grip. But the elements were stronger. With a deafening crack, the wing of his fighter tore away from the fuselage. The aircraft, out of control, entered a spin. Zemke miraculously managed to escape the disintegrating cockpit and pull the parachute's ripcord. As he descended under the silk canopy, he watched the wreckage of his plane fall to the earth. He landed in enemy territory, alive, unharmed, but defeated. Not by a man, but by the sky he knew so well. Soon, he was surrounded by a German patrol. When he was brought to the prisoner of war camp, Stalag Luftwaffe, the news of his arrival caused a real shock. A whisper rippled through the dusty, dreary crowd of captive airmen. Zemke's here, Colonel Zemke himself. For the German camp command, it was an incredible stroke of luck. Now, their collection included the two most famous legends of the Thunderbolts. Francis Gabreski, the top ace, captured due to his own mistake, and Hubert Zemke, the great tactician, brought down by a thunderstorm. The two leaders of the Wolf Pack were in the same cage, and in the 56th Fighter Group, a feeling akin to orphanhood set in. Their father, their teacher, their indestructible leader, was a prisoner. The enemy he fought so successfully couldn't defeat him. He was beaten by the blind, indifferent force of nature. This news became a harsh reminder to the pilots of the fragility of human destiny. If even Zemke, a genius of tactics and survival, could simply fall from the sky like that, it meant that absolutely everyone was vulnerable. It meant there was no armor, no experience, that could guarantee your life. The war went on. The Wolfpack continued to fly missions, continued to shoot down enemies, continued to lose its own. But something had subtly changed. With Zemke's departure, a part of their soul was gone, a part of their confidence. They were still the best. But now they knew, even the best can fall. And sometimes, the enemy you should fear most is not the man in the other plane, but just bad weather. Major Gunther Rahl, the third highest scoring ace in human history with 275 victories, sat in his Messerschmitt and realized with bitterness the rules had changed. He, a virtuoso of aerial combat, raised in the tradition of chivalrous duels, had encountered something new, something alien to the very idea of a fighter duel. He had just disengaged from a fight with a group of Thunderbolts, and it wasn't a fight. It wasn't even a brawl. It was a clash of two different philosophies, two different worlds. We are fencers, he thought, flying his light, maneuverable fighter. His Messerschmitt was a rapier, precise, elegant, deadly in skilled hands. He could dance in the sky, perform the most complex maneuvers, get on an enemy's tail where it seemed there wasn't a single chance. But Raoul glanced toward the departing American planes. They fight with clubs. He saw their tactics, crude, primitive, devoid of any elegance. They didn't try to outturn him. They didn't try to outfly him. They just used their mass, their unstoppable inertia. They dove from on high, delivered one terrible blow, and left without looking back. Raoul compared them to heavyweight boxers. Not very graceful, not particularly fast, but if they connected, it was a knockout. One accurate strike from their sledgehammer of 8 machine guns, and his elegant rapier turned into a pile of wreckage. This hit-and-run tactic was monstrously effective, and it was breaking everything the German pilots had been taught. Their school of air combat, honed in Spain, in Poland, in France, and in the skies over Britain, was becoming obsolete. It was designed for duels between equals, and this was not a duel. This was industrial warfare. I don't try to outdance him, an American instructor, a veteran of the skies over Germany, would tell his rookies at that very same time. I just wait for the moment to strike. Once. That's enough. And Günther Rahl, one of the greatest aces of all time, felt it firsthand. He could dodge once. He could dodge twice. But he was facing more than one club. There were dozens, hundreds, and with each passing month, there were more and more of them. America had thrown its entire industrial might onto the scales, and that might was embodied in the ugly, heavy, but indestructible Thunderbolt. Rahl understood. They were losing. Not because their pilots had gotten worse, not because their planes were inferior in maneuverability. They were losing because against this tactic of attrition, against this philosophy of brute force, their experience and skill were becoming powerless. The Americans weren't playing by their rules. They imposed their own. Rules where the winner is not the most skilled, but the heaviest, not the fastest, but the most durable. It was a bitter, reluctant admission, an admission of the superiority of pragmatic cruelty over a chivalry that was fading into the past. A fencer couldn't beat a man with a shotgun, and Günther Rahl knew that for him and for the entire Luftwaffe, the time for elegant duels was gone forever. The era of the sledgehammer had begun. December 1944, the Ardennes forest, Hitler's last desperate gamble. Hundreds of German tanks, hidden under the cover of thick fog and low clouds, break through the American front. The Battle of the Bulge begins. For the American soldiers on the ground, it was hell. A surprise attack, a shortage of ammunition, cold, and despair. They retreated, surrounded, freezing in their foxholes, and every day they looked up at the gray, impenetrable sky and prayed. They didn't pray for reinforcements, not for food. They prayed for the sun, because they knew, as soon as the sky cleared, help would come. Meanwhile, at airfields in England and France, there was a tense, nervous wait. Hundreds of Thunderbolts stood ready, fueled, armed to the teeth with bombs, rockets, and ammunition. Their pilots sat for days in briefing rooms, smoking, playing cards, and watching reports from the front, feeling helpless. Their main weapon, air superiority, had been taken away by bad weather. But then, On Christmas Day, a miracle happened. The sky began to clear, the clouds dispersed, and the command "Scramble" rang out like an alarm bell. What happened next went down in history as one of the largest and most brutal air operations. Hundreds, thousands of Thunderbolts and other ground attack aircraft took to the skies. They came in wave after wave, and when they reached the Ardennes, their pilots saw a sight they would never forget for the rest of their lives. Below, on the snow-covered roads, stretching for kilometers, were German tank columns. They were defenseless, a perfect target. "We have a visual," a group commander radioed. "They're sitting ducks, going to work." And the work began. For the Thunderbolt pilots, this was the apex of their power. They were no longer just fighters. They were a punishing sword from the heavens. They felt like arbiters of history. Today, here and now, they were winning this battle. They dived on the columns, unleashing their 5-inch rockets. A direct hit from such a rocket on a Tiger or Panther tank would turn it into a heap of smoldering metal. They dropped 500-pound bombs into clusters of supply trucks, causing secondary ammunition explosions. And then they would return, strafing what was left of the columns at treetop level, drenching everything in lead from their 8 heavy-caliber machine guns. For the German tankers on the ground, the apocalypse had begun. They, who had been the hunters just yesterday, were suddenly the prey. They tried to disperse, to hide in the forest. But the Thunderbolts were everywhere. The roar of their engines never ceased for a moment. They nicknamed these planes Panzerschreck am Himmel, tank terror in the sky. This terror was absolute. There was no escape from it. You could be the best tanker in the world, sitting in the most heavily armored machine. But against an attack from the sky, you were powerless. The Wehrmacht's offensive faltered. Not in tank battles, not in infantry counterattacks. It drowned in the fire and steel that rained down from the heavens. The Thunderbolt had definitively established itself in its new role. It was no longer a fighter that could take a punch. It had become a tank in the air, one that delivered devastating blows itself. In those Christmas days of 1944, Alexander Kartvel's philosophy achieved its triumph. His flying sledgehammer, created to save the lives of pilots, was now deciding the outcome of the largest ground battles. It wasn't just surviving the war, it was winning it. 1945. The war in Europe was drawing to a close. For most pilots, this meant one thing: just survive. Don't take unnecessary risks, complete the mission, and return home. But there were others, those for whom the war had become a drug, those who had flirted with death for so long they no longer noticed it. Elvin E.G. Righetti was one of them. In the ground attack squadrons, his name was a legend. He wasn't just an ace, he was the king of strafing, an artist of destruction. His tactic was simple and insane. He attacked lower than anyone else, much lower. His comrades joked that after Righetti's sorties, the mechanics didn't just pull branches off his tail, but telephone wires too. He flew so low, it seemed he could shake hands with an enemy gunner before turning his position to dust. This incredible audacity brought unbelievable results. To his credit were dozens of destroyed locomotives, hundreds of trucks, batteries, and airfields. He became the living embodiment of Jabberschreck, the fighter-bomber terror. But the line between heroism and recklessness in war is incredibly thin, and Righetti crossed it every day. On his last day, he was leading his group to attack a German airfield. It was a routine, almost mundane task. But for Righetti, there was no such thing as routine. There was only the thrill. He went in on the target first, as always, at an extremely low altitude, Hangars and the runway flashed beneath the wings of his Thunderbolt. He saw people scrambling on the ground. He saw the flashes of anti-aircraft guns. But he paid them no mind. He was in his element. He chose his target, a Messerschmitt on the ground, and squeezed the trigger. 8 machine guns spat fire. The enemy fighter exploded. Rigetti flew through the fireball, pulling out of the attack. He could have left, gained altitude, returned to base with another victory. But he didn't. He decided to make another pass. His comrades in the sky saw him turn his jug around to strike again. It was pure madness. The Germans had already found his range. The entire airfield's fire was now concentrated on him alone. He raced over the ground again. So low, it seemed his propeller was about to clip the concrete. And this time, his luck ran out. One of the German flak gunners, perhaps already doomed himself, didn't run for cover. He stayed at his gun and kept firing, and his shells found their mark. Rigetti's Thunderbolt shuddered. Black smoke poured from the engine. But even then, he didn't try to gain altitude. He kept flying straight, trying to make it back to friendly lines. But the plane, mortally wounded, was no longer responding. It caught a wing on the ground, flipped over, and exploded. Silence fell over the radio. The king of strafing was dead. He was killed by the very same audacity that had made him a legend. For his comrades, it was a hard, stark lesson. Rigetti had shown them how to attack, and with his death, he showed them when to stop. He was the best at this dangerous game, but he pushed his luck with death too far, and in the end, she claimed him. And somewhere below, on the destroyed German airfield, an anonymous gunner perhaps looked at the pillar of black smoke and felt a bitter satisfaction. It was a small, insignificant victory in a war already lost. But he had proven that even kings are not immortal. Even the most audacious juggernauts can fall. You just have to get too close, too bold. May 8th, 1945. Europe held its breath. The war was over. On all fronts, the guns fell silent. Soldiers crawled out of their trenches, unable to believe their luck. Pilots on airfields hugged, cried, and drank to victory, to life, to those who didn't return. But in one place, the war was still going on. In the cockpit of a Thunderbolt bearing the name Dottie May, Lieutenant Henry Brandt was flying over Austria. His mission was strange, almost surreal for this day. He was to conduct reconnaissance and a show of force over territories that were not yet aware of Germany's surrender. Just fly over, show the flag, and remind them who now owned the sky. The weather was bad. Low, heavy clouds clung to the peaks of the Alps. Brandt flew low, navigating by rivers and roads. He wasn't looking for a fight. He was just carrying out his final order. He was flying over the quiet, picturesque Lake Tronsey. The water was calm, almost a mirror. And at that moment, his powerful double Wasp engine, which had carried him through dozens of battles, which had withstood hundreds of hits, suddenly coughed, sputtered, and died. A deafening, unnatural silence descended. Only the whistle of the wind could be heard. Brandt acted on instinct. He tried to restart the engine. Once, twice, useless. The 7-ton fighter, deprived of its power, had become a glider. A very heavy and very clumsy glider. He knew he wouldn't make it to a flat piece of land. The only chance was to ditch it in the water. He leveled the plane, extended the flaps to bleed off speed, and braced for impact. Dottie May touched the surface of the lake. The impact was hard, but not fatal. The plane skidded across the water for several dozen meters, sending up fountains of spray, and began to sink. Cold lake water flooded the cockpit. Brandt got out, inflated his life vest, and swam away. He watched as his faithful Thunderbolt, his brother in arms, slowly, almost with dignity, slipped beneath the waves. The tail rose up, and a few moments later, only spreading ripples remained on the surface. This was the last Thunderbolt lost in the European theater of operations on May 8, 1945. On the very last day of the war, not in combat, not from enemy fire, but from a ridiculous mechanical failure. The pilot was picked up by local fishermen, and on airfields across Europe, his comrades asked themselves, "What's next? The war is over. We survived. This machine carried us through hell and brought us home. What will happen to it now? And what will happen to us?" The feeling of relief was mixed with a sense of emptiness and uncertainty. They were made for this war, and so were their planes. The people of European cities and villages looked at the thousands of fighters lined up on former battlefields. Just yesterday, these machines were a symbol of terror for some and liberation for others. Today, they were just metal, vast, silent monuments to the slaughter that had just ended. The era of the Thunderbolt was coming to a close. Their final mission was complete. The war was over, and the victors faced a new problem. A problem of surplus. Thousands of tanks, millions of rifles, and 15,636 Thunderbolts. A vast armada that no longer had a place in a peaceful sky. There were no parades for them. They were not awarded medals. Immediately after the victory, thousands of these mighty machines were declared obsolete. Their fate was decided quickly and pragmatically. Scrapping. Huge airfields in Arizona and Texas were turned into aircraft boneyards. Yesterday's formidable predators stood in neat, endless rows under the scorching sun. Their engines and gun sights were removed, and then a giant press crushed them into shapeless bales of aluminum. The sledgehammer that had crushed the Reich's war machine was itself being smashed to pieces. Historians and analysts began to tally the results. The numbers were staggering. During the war, Thunderbolts destroyed over 7,000 enemy aircraft, in the air and on the ground, 9,000 locomotives, 6,000 tanks and armored vehicles, 68,000 trucks. They dropped hundreds of thousands of tons of bombs and fired millions of rockets. Historian Martin Caden would later write the defining words that became this machine's epitaph. The P-47 was not a fighter in the classic sense. It was a sledgehammer that fell upon the Third Reich and smashed it to pieces. But for the veterans who flew them, these weren't just numbers. They were memories. Years later, gray-haired men, the former boys from Ohio, Texas, and California, would get together. And they would remember. They remembered not the glory of victory, but the roar of the 18-cylinder engine. They remembered the way the control stick shook. They remembered the feeling of absolute confidence this machine gave you as you went into a dive. "He was big, ugly, and loud," said Francis Gabreski, a top ace who survived being a POW and returned home. "But he was my friend. He always brought me home. Almost always." In those words was the entire essence of the Thunderbolt. It wasn't perfect. It was faithful. It was an honest machine that gave you a chance to survive where survival seemed impossible. For the post-war generation, who saw the few surviving Thunderbolts in museums, it was no longer a fearsome weapon, but a historical artifact, a silent witness to a bygone era of total war and of the crushing industrial might that won it. They didn't see a sledgehammer, but a monument. Its own pilots called it a flying coffin. The Germans laughed at the milk truck, but they were wrong. They were laughing at the most perfect machine for total annihilation ever created by man. It didn't know how to fight by the rules, and it forced the whole world to play by its own. Its greatest weakness, its monstrous weight, became its greatest weapon. And this clumsy, ugly, but indestructible sledgehammer ultimately ground more enemy hardware to dust and broke more lives than any other, more elegant fighter in history. Its story is not a hymn to elegance. It is a brutal but honest epitaph to brute force. The force that won. 1941. The Design Bureau of the Republic Aviation Company. The air smells of tobacco and drafting paper. Engineer Alexander Kartveli is hunched over a table, but he isn't seeing lines and calculations. He sees the dispatches from Europe. He sees Spitfires and flames falling from the skies over the English Channel. He sees the lists of pilots who didn't return to base, and he hears a quiet but insistent voice inside him. The voice of an émigré who fled the Bolsheviks, who knows the price of a human life in the grinding gears of total war. The U.S. Army Air Forces Command had laid out the task with perfect clarity. They need a light, high-altitude interceptor, an elegant rapier capable of dueling with German Messerschmitts on equal terms, maneuverable, fast-climbing, elegant, a knight of the sky. And now, in an office full of generals, Kartveli unrolls his blueprints. Silence falls, a heavy, ringing silence. Because on the paper, they don't see a rapier, they see a sledgehammer. This wasn't a fighter. It was a flying truck. A monster built not according to the laws of aerodynamics, but in spite of them. It weighed 7 tons, almost twice as much as a Spitfire, a weight that should have pinned it to the ground. The generals looked at Kartveli with a silent question. Is this a joke? One of them couldn't take it anymore. Mr. Kartveli, we asked for an interceptor. You've designed a flying tank. How is this thing supposed to fight Göring's light and maneuverable fighters? It won't even be able to turn. But Kartveli was calm. He knew they only saw the numbers, the weight and dimensions. They were thinking in terms of the old war, in terms of jousting tournaments in the sky. But he had already seen the future. Gentlemen, his voice was quiet but firm, the war in Europe is not a jousting tournament. It's a meat grinder. My job is not elegance. My job is the pilot's survival. He showed them the heart of his project, the giant 18-cylinder Pratt & Whitney double Wasp engine, the most powerful aircraft engine in the world. The plane wasn't designed around the pilot. It was designed around this engine. Kartveli had literally bolted wings and a cockpit onto it. Then he pointed to the armament. 8 heavy-caliber Browning machine guns, unheard-of firepower for a fighter, capable of not just damaging, but sawing an enemy plane to pieces. The generals were furious. All they saw were problems. The huge engine required a huge amount of fuel, which made the plane even heavier. To ensure it would work at high altitude, Kartveli had built in a highly complex turbo supercharger system. A labyrinth of armored ducts ran from the nose, under the cockpit, all the way to the tail and back. It ate up space, added weight, and made the design even more absurd. They saw a monster before them, slow, clumsy, a perfect target. But Kartveli saw something else. He saw the massive air-cooled engine becoming a shield, protecting the pilot from a frontal attack. He saw the sturdy airframe withstanding hits that would be fatal to any other plane. He saw his pilot, riddled with bullets, wounded, but alive, returning home. My job, he repeated, looking the top general in the eye, is to bring the pilot home to his mother, even if it means wrapping an engine in armor and teaching it to fly. Power and armor will save more lives than maneuverability. The command had no choice. The war was already raging. There were no other projects ready for production. Gritting their teeth, they gave the green light. The contract was signed. The monster was born. It was given the name Thunderbolt, a strike of thunder. But the first ones to hear that thunder wouldn't be the enemy. It would be its own pilots. And they would be horrified by what they were expected to fly into battle. 1943. An airfield in England. Lieutenant Bill Gross, a young kid from Ohio, approaches his new aircraft for the first time. He doesn't see a Thunderbolt. He sees a huge, bloated, ugly piece of metal. He was used to light training planes that soared into the sky like birds. And this was no bird. This was a behemoth. The first time I sat in it, he would later recall, I thought this thing would never get off the ground. It was enormous. The takeoff run seemed to take forever. And he wasn't joking. To get 7 tons of steel off the ground, pilots had to race down nearly a kilometer of runway. They burned precious minutes and fuel, while their European colleagues in Spitfires were already long in the air. The first training flights were a shock to an entire generation of American pilots. They had been taught the art of aerial combat, the art of the maneuver, the turn, the dance with death. They were trained to be fencers, and they were handed a hammer. The machine was stubborn and inert. It entered a turn lazily, reluctantly gaining altitude. Pilots used to feeling the plane with their fingertips now wrestled with it, as if with a wild Mustang. But the worst part was the climb rate, or rather, the lack of it. The Thunderbolt literally wouldn't climb. It lost in a climb to everything, to Spitfires and most frighteningly, to German Messerschmitts. In a fighter cockpit, altitude is life. Whoever is higher dictates the terms of the fight. Whoever is higher sees the enemy first. Whoever is higher attacks. Whoever is lower dies, and the American pilots realized this with a chilling horror. They would always be lower. They sent us to war in a milk truck. That phrase thundered in the smoking rooms, in the mess halls, in letters home. It won't climb. It can barely turn. We're sitting ducks. The pilots felt cheated, betrayed. They had been sent to the very tip of the spear, but instead of a sharp point, they had a cobblestone. And on the other side of the English Channel, Luftwaffe pilots, veterans of the Battle of Britain and the Eastern Front, examined intelligence reports with bewilderment. A new American fighter? Huge, heavy, with an air-cooled engine, like their Focke-Wulfs, but much bigger. The first encounters in the sky confirmed their suspicions. The Americans were slow, clumsy. They were easy to outturn in a dogfight. They could be outclimbed. The German aces, hardened in hundreds of battles, saw them as the perfect target. Predictable. Easy. They nicknamed it Dickie Indianer, Fat Indian. And that nickname held everything: surprise, contempt, and the anticipation of easy victories. The first battles turned into a slaughter. The Thunderbolts tried to escort bombers, but couldn't get to an advantageous altitude in time. German fighters sliced through their formations from above like a knife through butter, attacked the defenseless flying fortresses, and escaped with impunity. The Americans could only watch them go, cursing their heavy, clumsy machines. Losses mounted. Disappointment gave way to despair. The dream of sky knighthood was shattering against harsh reality. They weren't hunters. They were bait. Fat, slow bait, thrown into a tank of piranhas. It seemed command had made a fatal mistake. It seemed the bet on brute force had been lost. In the cruel mathematics of aerial combat, the elegance of German engineering was defeating American industrial might, and no one yet suspected that the Thunderbolt's greatest flaw, its monstrous weight, would soon become its greatest and most lethal weapon. But to reach that revelation, they first had to survive. For now, In the cold skies over France, American pilots were learning to survive, and they hated their planes. A primal fear reigned in the skies over Europe. It was more ancient than the planes themselves, the fear of a strike from behind, of a threat you cannot see. And for the pilots of the early model Thunderbolts, nicknamed the Razorback, this fear became a tangible, almost physical sensation. 1943. Robert Johnson, a young lieutenant, guides his Razorback through the clouds. Below him, enemy territory. Around him, an empty, echoing sky. But he knows it's an illusion. They are here, somewhere out there, higher or behind. He's constantly turning his head, left, right, but most importantly, back. He tries to look past the massive metal spine that stretches from his seat to the plane's tail, but it's useless. There lies a dead zone, a huge blind spot where an enemy fighter can easily hide. You can't see who's on your six. That thought pounds in his temples, drowning out the roar of the powerful engine. Every flight is an anticipation of an attack. Every strange sound, every shadow in his peripheral vision makes his heart clench. You could be the best pilot, you could be the sharpest shooter, but you will die simply because you never saw the enemy. The experienced Luftwaffe aces understood this almost immediately. Their tactics became simple and merciless. Approach the fat Indian from high and behind, the veterans instructed the greenhorn rookies. He's as blind as a kitten. It's his Achilles heel. Use it ruthlessly. And they did. A German pilot would take a higher position. The sun would glare in the American's eyes, concealing the predatory silhouette of the Messerschmitt. Then he would begin a smooth, almost lazy dive, approaching directly into the Thunderbolt's blind spot. The American saw nothing. He didn't hear death approaching. He flew his 7-ton fighter, intently scanning the sky ahead, while he was already in the enemy's sights. The first sign of trouble would be flashes on the wings of the German fighter, and a fraction of a second later, a crash, the sound of tearing metal. 20-millimeter shells from the German cannons ripped through the fuselage, shattered instruments, and severed control lines. And often, they killed the pilot before he even realized what had happened. This tactic worked flawlessly. The losses in the American squadrons mounted. The fear of an attack from behind became a constant companion on every mission. Pilots returned to base completely exhausted, not from combat, but from the monstrous nervous strain. They asked mechanics to install extra mirrors. They flew, constantly rocking their wings, trying to catch even a fleeting glimpse of what was happening behind their tail. They asked their wingmen to fly as close as possible, covering each other's backs. But these were all half measures. A design flaw had become a death sentence for dozens of young pilots. They weren't dying in furious aerial duels, but as a result of cold-blooded, calculated executions. The enemy had found their weak spot, and they struck it again, and again, and again. It seemed the Razorback was doomed. Its weight made it clumsy. Its blindness made it defenseless. The pilots' hatred for this machine reached its peak. They called it a flying coffin, and now they had every reason to. But even in the darkest of times, when faith in the aircraft was all but lost, fate was preparing an event that would change everything. An event born from fire and pain. From the desperation of a single pilot who, against all odds, would refuse to die. And that pilot's name was Robert Johnson, the very same one now flying in the sky, not yet knowing that his personal hell was about to begin, and that his survival would become a legend, breathing new hope into the hearts of hundreds of his comrades. June 26, 1943. The sky over the English Channel. Lieutenant Robert Johnson is returning from hell. His group had just been attacked by a squadron of Focke-Wulfs. and Johnson lost that fight. He didn't see the enemy. He came from behind, from the blind spot, and opened fire. The first hit. A 20mm shell explodes in the cockpit. Johnson's world becomes a chaos of fire, smoke, and sharp pain. The canopy is ripped away by the airflow, and an icy wind bursts in, trying to tear the pilot from his seat. Hot, sticky hydraulic fluid splashes into his face, blinding him. He's wounded. He can't see a thing. His Thunderbolt is falling helplessly. The engine sputters. The instruments are shattered. The cockpit is filled with the smell of cordite and burnt wiring. "I was sure that was the end," he would say later. Through the haze of smoke and pain, he sees the silhouette of a German fighter appear alongside him. So close that Johnson can make out the pilot's face in the cockpit. The German ace rocks his wings. It was a knightly gesture, a farewell to a defeated foe. He saw the riddled American plane, saw the cockpit without a canopy, saw the streams of smoke and oil. He was absolutely certain the American was doomed. There was no need to finish him off. Turning away, the German flew off in search of a new victim. He didn't know that he had just made the biggest mistake of his life. He didn't know that he had become the unwitting creator of a legend, because Robert Johnson's plane did not want to die. In a semi-conscious state, blinded, Johnson fumbled for the control stick. He pulls it towards him, and the 7-ton monster, this clumsy milk truck, obeys. With a roar and a screech, it pulls out of the dive. The engine, riddled in several places, continues to run, shaking so violently it seems about to tear itself from the fuselage. Johnson is flying on instinct. He can't see the instruments. He doesn't know his altitude or his speed. He just keeps the nose of the machine pointed towards home, towards the white cliffs of Dover. Around him is the icy wind, whistling through the shattered cockpit. Below him, the cold waters of the English Channel. Every meter of this flight is agony. At the British airfield, they'd already written him off, presumed killed in action. But then a dot appears on the horizon. It's flying strangely, in lurches, leaving a thick black trail behind it. As it gets closer, the ground crews are horrified. It's not a plane. It's a sieve. A ghost returned from the other side. No canopy. With huge holes in the wings and fuselage, with its controls shot up. Johnson comes in for a landing. He can't lower the landing gear. He brings the plane down on its belly. With a deafening screech, the Thunderbolt plows for hundreds of meters along the runway, sending up fountains of dirt and sparks, and finally comes to a stop. People run towards the plane. They expect to find a dead body inside. But from the shattered cockpit, staggering, emerges Robert Johnson. Alive. The silence at the airfield is replaced by a roar. Mechanics, pilots, and officers surround the mangled machine. They can't believe their eyes. They counted over 200 holes in the fuselage, from machine gun bullets and 20mm shells. Any other plane would have disintegrated in midair from such damage, but not this one. The story of Johnson's miraculous return spreads like wildfire through all the bases of the 8th Air Force. Pilots who had cursed their planes just yesterday now looked at them with new eyes. Skepticism gave way to shock, shock to amazement, and amazement to a budding trust. This thing, this ugly, heavy, clumsy thing, it can bring us home, even from the deepest circle of hell. Alexander Kartvel's philosophy, his crazy idea of a flying tank, had found its bloody but undeniable proof. Survivability is a weapon too, perhaps the most important one. On that day, the Thunderbolt ceased to be a flying coffin. It began to become the Juggernaut, an unstoppable force. 1944, Luftwaffe Fighter Command Headquarters. Lieutenant General Adolf Galland, legendary ace and inspector of fighter forces for the Reich, leaned grimly over his desk. Before him lay not maps or battle plans. Before him lay the combat reports of his best pilots, and what he read filled him with growing alarm. Target engaged from 6 o'clock, fired a long burst from two 20mm cannons and two heavy machine guns. Multiple hits observed on the fuselage and wing root. Black smoke poured from the target's engine. But the P-47 didn't catch fire. It didn't break apart. It continued to fly and escaped in a dive. Such reports were repeated again and again, with frightening regularity. Veterans, with dozens, even hundreds of kills to their names, all complained about the same thing. The new American fighter simply refused to go down. Galland, a brilliant pilot himself, understood the psychology of air combat perfectly. A dogfight is a matter of seconds. You have to shoot down the enemy on the first pass. If the attack fails, you become vulnerable yourself. You've wasted precious seconds, lost the element of surprise, and expended ammunition. And while you're trying to finish off one stubborn American, his wingman is already on your tail. Our pilots are spending too much ammunition on a single P-47, reported the squadron commanders. They get distracted, becoming easy targets for other fighters. This machine is draining our resources and breaking our morale. At first, Galland didn't believe it. He thought they were just excuses from pilots who had failed their mission, but the reports grew more and more insistent. "We've seen them fly away with huge holes in their fuselages," wrote one ace. "A standard burst is often not enough to destroy it," confirmed another. It was demoralizing. Young German pilots, raised on stories of lightning victories, were facing an opponent that didn't play by the rules, one that could withstand their deadliest attacks and escape, leaving an unsettling feeling in the soul of a Luftwaffe pilot, a mixture of surprise, frustration, and fear. Galland was forced to admit the Americans had created something new. They had countered German artistry of maneuver and precision gunnery with brute, indestructible survivability. And that survivability had become a serious tactical factor. He issued a new order, a new tactical recommendation for all pilots fighting on the Western Front. The P-47 Thunderbolt is an exceptionally tough machine. It is necessary to concentrate fire on the cockpit or the wing roots, where the fuel tanks are located. Do not spray ammunition across the entire fuselage. Make your shots count. It was a moment of truth, an admission from the enemy. The Luftwaffe High Command had officially acknowledged that Alexander Kartvel's engineering philosophy worked, that his flying tank had changed the rules of aerial warfare. Now, to shoot down a Thunderbolt, a German pilot had to get closer, take greater risks, aim longer. And that meant exposing himself to fire. And on the other side of the English Channel, the command of the 8th Air Force was analyzing its own reports with astonishment. "Our fighter losses are significantly lower than expected," the statisticians reported. "The return rate of damaged aircraft to base is abnormally high." The generals who had once looked at Kartvel's blueprints with contempt now saw irrefutable proof that he had been right. Durability is also a weapon, and while their pilots kept returning from the most hopeless situations, the German aces were increasingly not returning at all. America's industrial might, embodied in this 7-ton monster, began to slowly but relentlessly grind down the elite of the German Air Force. The enemy had acknowledged the power of the Juggernaut, and for them, that acknowledgement was the beginning of the end. Colonel Hubert Zemke, commander of the 56th Fighter Group, looked into the eyes of his pilots. He saw fatigue, fear, but most of all, he saw disappointment. They were the top graduates from America's flight schools. They were taught to win. And here, in the cold skies over Europe, they were losing. 1943, a pre-flight briefing. The air was thick with cigarette smoke and tense silence. Zemke knew he had to change something, radically, right now. Gentlemen, his voice was calm, but it cut through the air like a scalpel. Everything you've been taught up to this point, forget it. All those graceful turns, all those aerial duels, that's garbage. It's a sure way to get killed. The pilots exchanged glances. Had their commander lost his mind? Our plane, Zemke continued, is as heavy as a pregnant cow. It can't dance. If you try to outturn a Messerschmitt or a Focke-Wulf, they'll get on your tail and turn you into Swiss cheese. I forbid you from entering a turning fight. Remember that, once and for all. He paused, scanning the faces of his men. But this machine has one quality. One, but it's decisive. It weighs 7 tons, and when that mass starts falling from 10,000 meters, nothing can stop it. The Thunderbolt can outdive any plane the Germans can put in the air. Use it. That day, Hubert Zemke rewrote the tactical manual for fighter aviation. He understood something that neither his pilots, nor the high command, nor even the enemy understood. The Thunderbolt's greatest weakness, its monstrous weight, was its greatest strength. It just had to be used correctly. We don't dance with them, Zemke hammered home. We strike like a hammer, from top to bottom. We gain altitude before we enter the combat zone. We take a position above them. We see them first. We pick our target, and we fall on it like hawks. The boom and zoom tactic was born. Hit and run. No dogfights, no chivalry, only cold, ruthless calculation. Dive, shoot, get out, he drilled into his pilots' heads. You fire one short, devastating burst from 8 machine guns. And it doesn't matter if you hit or miss. You don't look back. You don't try to see the result. You use the speed gained in the dive to climb back up, to your altitude, to your element. This isn't a duel. This is a hunt. The pilots of the 56th group listened, and in their eyes, fear gave way to understanding, and understanding to a predatory gleam. They were no longer the victims. They were becoming the hunters. Hunters who dictate their own rules. And on the other side of the front, the Luftwaffe pilots encountered something inexplicable. The Americans had changed. They stopped engaging in turning fights. They simply disappeared from the altitudes where the Germans were used to dominating. Now they were somewhere up there, in the thin air, at 10 kilometers, almost invisible. And then they would appear, out of nowhere, with a howl that froze the blood in your veins. A dot hurtling towards you from the sky, transforming in a split second into a roaring 7-ton monster. You had no time to react. You could only instinctively yank the control stick, praying the tracers from the heavy machine guns would miss. And then it would flash past you like an express train and disappear. You tried to catch it in a dive, but it was useless. Your lightweight Messerschmitt would start to vibrate, threatening to fall apart, while the Americans simply pulled away, as if tied to an invisible rubber band. They've stopped fighting, the German aces reported with bewilderment. They just fall on us from high altitude and disappear. We can't catch them. The rules of the game have changed. Hubert Zemke and his wolf pack, as the 56th group would soon be called, didn't just adapt to their machine. They created a new philosophy of combat for it. They turned a lumbering behemoth into the most dangerous predator in the sky. A predator that doesn't chase its prey, but waits for it in ambush, delivering a single, fatal strike. And that strike would soon become the signature of the Thunderbolt and a requiem for hundreds of Luftwaffe pilots. Major Robert Rosenthal, a Thunderbolt pilot, knew this sound better than his own heartbeat. At first, it was a quiet, barely perceptible whistle, like a whisper of wind, but then it would build, turning into a low-frequency hum that vibrated in every bone of your body, and finally, it would break into a deafening, furious roar, the wail of a banshee, the roar of a predator hurtling towards its prey. This was the sound of 7 tons of steel piercing the air at 800 kilometers per hour. This was the sound of his jug in a dive. American pilots adopted Zemke's new tactics not just as a guide to action. They turned it into an art form, into their religion. They realized a simple and brutal truth. Up high, in a climb, they were vulnerable. In a horizontal turn, they were weak. But in a vertical fight, in a dive, they were gods. Every sortie now followed the same script. A long, grueling climb. 10, sometimes even 11,000 meters. There, where the air was thin and cold, and the engines of German fighters began to gasp, the Thunderbolt's turbo supercharger took a full breath. They were on the roof of the world. From here, they could see everything. Below, 2 or 3 kilometers down, the diamonds and crosses of the German squadrons looked like toys. They flew confidently in their usual combat formation, scanning the horizon. They didn't look up. They weren't expecting a strike from there, from the stratosphere. And then it began. The pilot pushed the stick forward. The nose of the Thunderbolt dropped, and gravity took over. 7 tons of metal, guided only by the force of gravity and the power of an 18-cylinder engine, began their fall. The speed indicator needle crept to the right with frightening speed. 600 kilometers per hour, 700, 800. Sometimes, in a prolonged dive, it would push past 1,000, approaching the speed of sound. The plane trembled. The airframe groaned under the monstrous pressure. But the pilots knew this machine would hold. The design created by Kartveli had an immense margin of safety. Down below, in the German cockpit, the first sign of impending doom was the sound. That same building wail. The Luftwaffe pilot would snap his head up and see it. A black dot hurtling straight for him. He had no chance. He couldn't evade. He couldn't climb. The Thunderbolt was too fast. He couldn't dive. The Thunderbolt would catch him in a dive. The only thing he could do was survive the attack. And in the cockpit of the Jug, the world narrowed to a single point. The enemy aircraft in the crosshairs of the gun sight. The pilot didn't think. He acted on instinct. A split second before he would flash past the target, his finger squeezed the trigger. 8 heavy-caliber machine guns spat out 100 bullets a second. It wasn't fire. It was a torrent of molten lead. A circular saw that sliced off wings, ripped open fuselages, and turned the cockpits of enemy fighters into a bloody mess. The burst lasted 1, maybe 2 seconds, and that was it. Attack over. The pilot pulled back on the stick, experiencing monstrous G-forces that pressed him into his seat and threatened to black him out. The kinetic energy gained in the dive shot him back up to a safe altitude. He didn't even look to see if the enemy went down. It didn't matter. What mattered was to survive and be ready for the next attack. In this new world, there was no room for finesse. This was raw, primal physics, mass multiplied by velocity, the blow of a hammer from which there was no defense. In a dive, we were kings, Major Rosenthal recalled. A German might be better than you in a turn, but if you went into a dive, all he could do was watch you go. The sound of our dive, it was a requiem for anyone below. And this requiem was heard more and more often in the skies over the Reich. The Luftwaffe pilots, who just yesterday were the masters of the sky, began to fear it. They began to avoid fights with Thunderbolts. They began to lose the war in the air, not because the Americans became better flyers, but because they had learned how to fall, faster, more furiously, and more lethally than anyone else. 1944. A new predator appeared in the skies over Europe. Sleek, long-range, deadly, the P-51 Mustang. It could escort bombers all the way to Berlin and back, fighting German fighters on equal terms. And with its arrival, the role of the Thunderbolt changed dramatically. The High Command reasoned simply, why use a heavy sledgehammer where there is now a sharp rapier? The Mustangs would take over the fights in the stratosphere, and the Juggernauts, their immense power and legendary survivability, would find a new purpose. Down below, on the deck. For Lieutenant Don Flash Smith and hundreds like him, the new orders sounded like a death sentence. They, the knights of high-altitude combat, were being turned into flying artillery. Their task was now ground attack, the destruction of ground targets, trains, bridges, convoys, artillery positions, and entrenched infantry. We used to be afraid of a single fighter on our tail, Smith said with bitterness. Now, every rock on the ground is shooting at us. This was a completely different war, dirty, brutal, without rules. There was no hit-and-run tactic here. Here, you had to fly low, extremely low, at treetop level, almost clipping the tops of the trees, and below, hell awaited them. Every German soldier with a rifle, every machine gun crew, every anti-aircraft battery. They all looked to the sky and waited for the roar of an 18-cylinder engine. Escorting bombers was dangerous, one veteran recalled. But ground attack was suicide. You fly straight into a wall of fire. Tracers from flak shells fly towards you like fireballs. You see the muzzle flashes on the ground. You hear the bullets drumming against your armor. Every mission is a lottery. But it was here, in this hell, that the Thunderbolt truly came into its own. Its durability, which saved it from fighters, now saved it from ground fire. The massive engine absorbed shrapnel. The armored cockpit protected the pilot. The plane could return to base with punctured oil lines, with holes in its wings, with severed control cables. It forgave mistakes. It gave you a chance. And the pilots paid back this chance in spades. On their external hardpoints, their jugs now carried not only fuel tanks. They carried 1,130 kilograms of bombs. They carried 10 tube launchers with 5-inch HVAR rockets, each one comparable in power to a shell from a 105mm howitzer. And they still had their 8 heavy-caliber machine guns. For the German troops on the ground, the appearance of Thunderbolts became a nightmare. First, they would hear that characteristic, unmistakable roar. And then, from behind the tree line or a hill, an armada would appear. Dozens of aircraft, hurtling straight at them. Their trenches and equipment were turned into a seething cauldron. Bombs blew up tanks. Rockets blasted artillery pieces to splinters. And 8 machine guns turned trucks and infantry into a bloody mess. They would pass over the positions at such a low altitude that German soldiers could see the faces of the American pilots, faces contorted with fury and strain. After the Normandy landings, Thunderbolts became the primary instrument of the battlefield isolation doctrine. They hung over the roads, hunting every convoy that tried to bring reinforcements to the front. They destroyed bridges. They shot up locomotives. They paralyzed the entire logistics of the Wehrmacht. The German soldiers gave them a new name, not the Fat Indian, but Jabeschreck, the fighter-bomber terror. This terror was primal. It made experienced tank crews abandon their vehicles and hide in the woods at the mere sound of an approaching plane. It demoralized them, broke their will to resist. The fighter pilots who became ground attack pilots paid a terrible price. Losses in ground attack squadrons were many times higher than in escort groups. But every time they returned to base in a machine that was shot to pieces but still flying, they silently thanked a man they had never met. The engineer Alexander Kartveli, the man who built not an elegant fighter, but an unbreakable sledgehammer. A sledgehammer that was now smashing the war machine of the Third Reich. July 20th, 1944. There was a festive mood at the airfield of the 56th Fighter Group. Their top ace, Major Francis Gabreski, was heading home. The son of Polish immigrants, who fought with a special personal fury, he had become a legend. 28 confirmed aerial victories, more than anyone else in Europe. He had completed his tour of duty, 300 combat hours over enemy territory. He had survived. He had won. His bags were already packed. The ticket to the States was in his pocket. Fame, the embrace of his family, and peaceful skies awaited him. But war doesn't let go that easily. Another fighter sweep mission was scheduled for that day. Gabreski wasn't supposed to fly. He was already a guest, an outside observer, but he stood by the runway, watching his comrades climb into their cockpits, and he felt that familiar itch in his fingertips. The hunter's thrill, the desire to take one more, final shot. "I'll fly with you," he told his commander. "One more time, for luck." It was reckless, a violation of all the rules, but no one dared refuse the living god of the Thunderbolts. They assigned him a plane, and he took to the sky with his squadron. For the last time, they flew low over Germany, searching for a target, and they found one. A German airfield. Heinkel bombers were standing on the ground, easy, tempting prey. Gabreski led the group into the attack. He was a master of ground attack, but today he was driven by something more than cold calculation. It was pure bravado, the desire to go out in style, to put a bold final mark on his military career. He went in for the target first, showering the German planes with lead from his 8 machine guns. One Heinkel exploded. Gabreski flew over it and went around for a second pass. His wingman yelled into the radio, "Get out, Gabby, get out! It's too dangerous." But Gabreski wasn't listening. He was intoxicated by the fight, the speed, the proximity of victory. He decided to make another pass, this time even lower, even more daring. "I went in too low," he would later say. He could see the grass beneath his plane. He could see the faces of the German technicians as they ran. He squeezed the trigger, aiming for the next bomber, and in that moment, his world turned upside down. The tip of his 4-meter propeller clipped the ground. There was a deafening screech. The 7-ton Thunderbolt nosed over. Gabreski desperately pulled back on the stick, trying to level the machine, but it was too late. Losing speed, the fighter slammed down on its belly and, sending up fountains of mud, plowed for several hundred meters across the airfield. Silence fell. His comrades in the sky watched in horror at their commander's motionless aircraft, surrounded by German soldiers. They couldn't help him. Gabreski survived. Climbing out of the cockpit, he bolted for the nearest woods. For 5 days he hid, trying to make his way back to his own lines. Hungry and exhausted, he ate berries and drank from streams. But the dragnet was closing in. He was eventually captured and sent to a prisoner of war camp. To the very same Stalag Luftwaffe, where hundreds of downed American and British pilots were already being held. The news of Gabreski's capture hit the 8th Air Force like a thunderclap. Their top ace, their hero, not shot down in combat, not defeated by an enemy pilot. He was caught because of his own mistake, because of one extra unnecessary attack. Shock and bitter despondency swept through his group. "He was the best of us," the pilot said. "If even he could be caught, then none of us stand a chance." This story became a harsh lesson, a lesson that war does not forgive overconfidence. It makes no allowances for past achievements. One mistake, and all your victories mean nothing. You can be the best ace in the world's most durable plane, but a single moment of recklessness, one wrong move, and you go from being a hero to prisoner of war, number 6888. The greatest hunter had ended up in a cage himself, and he would not be returning home for a very long time. The story of the Thunderbolt is not just a chronicle of victories. It is a brutal parable of how an ugly, pragmatic sledgehammer shattered the elegant rapier of chivalrous duels. This aircraft was an honest reflection of its era, an era of total war, where survival is valued more than elegance, and victory belongs not to the most skillful, but to the most indestructible. But what do we lose when, to defeat evil, we create the ultimate instrument of destruction? And doesn't that brute force, once victorious, become the only rule the world will play by from then on? What do you think? Is the story of this machine a hymn to pragmatism or a requiem for a lost chivalry? Share your thoughts in the comments. If stories like this make you think, support our channel with a subscription and a like. It helps us continue searching for answers to complex questions.